Hey, everyone, picture this. It's Berlin, 1945, and the Nazi regime is crumbling, the world finally starting to breathe a sigh of relief as World War II comes to an end. But for thousands of German women, the end of the war isn't a moment of peace. It's the beginning of a nightmare nobody talks about. As Soviet soldiers flood into the city, they bring a wave of violence that hits the most vulnerable the hardest. Women and girls targeted in a campaign of mass rapes that scars an entire generation. Not just numbers on a page, but real people. Mothers, daughters, sisters, stripped of their dignity and left to rebuild their lives in the shadows of shame. In this video, we're going to pull back the curtain on one of the darkest, most overlooked chapters of history, digging into survivor stories, historical records, and expert analysis to uncover the truth about what happened in those chaotic days, asking why this tragedy was swept under the rug for so long, what it tells us about the cost of war and the value of every human life, and how we can honor the courage of those who endured while learning lessons to ensure horrors like this never happen again. So stick with me for a journey into the heart of humanity's darkest moments. And if you're ready to face the truth, hit that subscribe button and let's get started. Imagine Berlin in the spring of 1945, a city in ruins, buildings reduced to rubble, streets filled with the stench of smoke and fear, the Nazi regime on its last legs, Hitler hiding in his bunker, and the Soviet Red Army closing in, exhausted but determined after years of brutal fighting against the Nazis. Their own cities destroyed, their families torn apart, and now they're in the heart of the enemy's territory. But what happens next isn't just about soldiers and battles. It's about ordinary people, especially women, caught in a war they didn't start. These women, mothers, daughters, grandmothers, teenagers, aren't soldiers. They're just trying to survive, protect their families, find food, hide from bombs. But as the Soviets take control, the city becomes a place of chaos. No law, no order, just fear, and for German women, the arrival of the Soviet army brings a new kind of terror that will change their lives forever. To understand the scale of this tragedy, let's paint a fuller picture of Berlin at that time. The city was a shadow of its former self, its once vibrant neighborhoods reduced to piles of debris, with families huddled in basements or makeshift shelters, rationing scraps of bread and water, the constant sound of artillery fire echoing in the distance, and the ever-present dread of what might come next, as the Nazi propaganda machine had warned of the Soviets' brutality, creating a climate of terror even before the soldiers arrived. Berlin's population was weary, malnourished, and living in constant fear, with air raids shattering what little normalcy remained, and the collapse of infrastructure meant no electricity, no running water, and scarce medical supplies, leaving civilians, especially women, to fend for themselves in a city that felt like a war zone long before the Soviets arrived. The psychological toll of living under such conditions cannot be overstated. Families were separated, children orphaned, and the ever-looming threat of violence hung over every decision, from venturing out for food to deciding where to hide during the next bombardment. The Soviet troops, hardened by years of unimaginable losses, over 20 million Soviet citizens died during the war, entire villages wiped out, carried with them a mix of exhaustion, anger, and a thirst for retribution. And while their mission was to crush the Nazi regime, the collapse of order in Berlin created a vacuum where discipline broke down, and the most vulnerable paid the price. The Red Army's advance was relentless, driven by a desire to end the war and punish those they held responsible. But the lack of centralized control in the final days of the conflict meant that many soldiers operated without oversight, their actions fueled by a toxic blend of trauma, propaganda, and the chaos of victory. The city's descent into lawlessness was exacerbated by the breakdown of communication and command structures, with Soviet units often acting independently, their leaders preoccupied with strategic objectives rather than maintaining discipline, creating an environment where unchecked violence could thrive. The Nazi propaganda that preceded the Soviet arrival painted them as barbaric invaders, amplifying the fear among Berlin's civilians, who had already endured years of Allied bombings and the oppressive control of the Nazi regime, leaving them physically and emotionally drained, with no means to defend themselves against what was to come. Historians estimate that tens of thousands of women, some say as many as 100,000 or more, were raped by Soviet soldiers in the spring and summer of 1945, not isolated incidents but a widespread, systematic wave of sexual violence that targeted women of all ages, from young girls to elderly women, in homes, basements, streets, even in front of their families. Why did this happen? War is messy, and it brings out the worst in some people. The Soviet soldiers had been through hell, their homeland invaded, millions of their people killed by the Nazis, And to some, this was revenge, a way to lash out at the enemy. But that doesn't justify it, nothing can. These women were innocent, not fighting, just trying to survive. The lack of clear orders from Soviet commanders to curb such behavior, combined with the chaos of a city under siege, allowed these atrocities to flourish, with some soldiers acting out of personal vendettas, others following a mob mentality, and a few even believing they were entitled to take what they wanted as victors, a mindset that dehumanized the very people they encountered. This dehumanization was rooted in years of wartime propaganda that painted all Germans as complicit in Nazi crimes, ignoring the reality that many civilians, particularly women, had no say in the policies of the Third Reich, their lives dictated by survival rather than ideology. The absence of accountability was stark. Soviet military records from the period show few instances of soldiers being disciplined for these acts, and the focus on securing Berlin meant that the plight of civilians was often ignored, with some commanders viewing the violence as an unfortunate but inevitable part of war's end. The propaganda machine on both sides played a significant role, with Nazi leaflets warning of Soviet savagery and Soviet propaganda glorifying their soldiers as avengers, creating a cycle of hatred that blurred the lines between combatant and civilian, making it easier for soldiers to justify their actions against innocent women, who were seen not as individuals but as symbols of the enemy. Let me tell you about Anna, a 19-year-old whose name we've changed to protect her privacy, living with her mother in a small Berlin apartment when Soviet soldiers broke in one night, her mother begging them to leave, but they didn't listen, raping Anna multiple times while her mother was forced to watch. Helpless, Anna later writing in her diary, "I felt like my soul was taken from me. I didn't know how to go on, but I had to. For my mother, for myself." Her story just one of thousands showing the human cost of this tragedy, not just victims but people with dreams, families, lives shattered. Anna's experience wasn't unique. Across Berlin, women faced similar horrors, some hiding in attics or cellars for days, only to be found and attacked, others dragged from their homes in broad daylight, their screams ignored in a city where survival was the only law. Imagine being in your home, already scared and hungry, and facing this kind of violence. Many women were raped multiple times, sometimes by groups of soldiers, some attacked in front of their children or husbands, others taken from their homes and held in makeshift camps where the abuse continued, the physical pain horrific, but the emotional scars even deeper, leaving women feeling shame, fear, hopelessness, many never speaking about it, not even to their families because the stigma was so heavy. The societal norms of the time added another layer of pain. Women were expected to remain pure, and victims of sexual violence were often seen as tainted, their suffering compounded by whispers and judgment from their own communities, forcing many to bury their trauma deep inside, carrying it like a silent wound for the rest of their lives. This stigma wasn't just a personal burden. It was a societal one, rooted in patriarchal values that prioritized a woman's honor over her humanity, making it nearly impossible for survivors to seek help or justice without facing further humiliation. Some women, like 22-year-old Greta, whose name is also changed, were shunned by their own neighbors after rumors of their assaults spread, forcing them to relocate to other parts of the city or country, starting over in places where their past was unknown. A painful reminder of how society failed these women twice, first by not protecting them, and then by judging them for their suffering. For Greta, the move meant leaving behind her childhood home, her friends, and the memories of a life before the war, a sacrifice made to escape the judgmental stares and whispered gossip that followed her. Yet she carried on, finding work as a seamstress and building a new life, her resilience a quiet defiance against the cruelty she endured. Yet, despite this trauma, so many women showed incredible strength, rebuilding their lives, caring for their families, carrying their pain in silence, like Maria, another survivor whose name we've changed, a 30-year-old mother of two who hid her kids in a closet to protect them when soldiers came to her neighborhood, enduring unimaginable violence to keep them safe, and afterward focusing on finding food, rebuilding their home, never telling her children what happened, her strength keeping her family together, showing us that even in the darkest moments, people can find courage, that human dignity, even when attacked, can never be fully taken away. Let's meet another survivor, Clara, a 25-year-old schoolteacher, who was attacked while trying to fetch water from a nearby pump, her assailants laughing as she begged for mercy. Yet Clara, like so many others, found a way to carry on, later volunteering at a local church to help other women, offering them comfort and a listening ear, her compassion a beacon of hope in a city drowning in despair. These stories of resilience aren't just inspiring. They're a reminder of the unbreakable human spirit, of women who, despite losing so much, refused to let their trauma define them, choosing instead to rebuild, to love, to hope, even when the world seemed to offer nothing but pain. Consider Lena, a 35-year-old seamstress, who, after surviving an assault in her own home, began sewing clothes for other survivors, bartering her skills for food and supplies, her small acts of kindness creating a network of support among women in her neighborhood. Or Sophia, a 17-year-old who, after enduring weeks of abuse in a makeshift Soviet camp, escaped and later wrote poetry to process her pain, her words a quiet rebellion against the silence imposed on her. These women, through their actions, showed that survival is more than just enduring. It's about reclaiming agency, finding purpose, and holding on to humanity in the face of inhumanity. Their stories a testament to the power of resilience and the enduring strength of the human heart. Another survivor, Ingrid, a 27-year-old baker, found solace in sharing her family's recipes with other women in her shelter, teaching them to bake simple breads with whatever flour they could scavenge. Her small acts of community building fostering a sense of normalcy and hope. Or consider Eva, a 50-year-old grandmother who, after surviving an attack, organized a group of women to distribute food to starving children in her district. Her leadership a quiet act of defiance against the chaos around her. These women's stories highlight the diversity of their responses to trauma. Some turned to creativity, others to community, but all found ways to assert their humanity, to prove that even in the darkest times, the human spirit can shine through, offering lessons and courage that resonate across generations. So why don't we hear more about this? Why has this tragedy been pushed to the shadows of history? There are a few reasons, and they're tough to swallow. In 1945, the world was focused on celebrating the end of World War II. The Allies had defeated the Nazis, and that was the big story. The suffering of German civilians, especially women, didn't fit into the victory narrative. Germany was the enemy, and many felt anything that happened to Germans was just part of the war's consequences. The global mood was one of triumph, with parades and speeches hailing the defeat of tyranny, and the idea of sympathizing with German civilians, even those who had no part in the Nazi regime's crimes, was unthinkable to many at the time, their suffering dismissed as collateral damage in a war they were blamed for starting. Then there was politics. After the war, the Soviet Union became a major world power and a temporary ally of the West, so talking about Soviet war crimes wasn't convenient. Governments and historians didn't want to stir up trouble, so these women's stories were buried, ignored, or downplayed. The Cold War was looming, and the Allies needed the Soviet Union to maintain the fragile post-war balance. So reports of Soviet atrocities were often suppressed or relegated to whispers, with official narratives focusing on Nazi crimes instead, leaving little room for the stories of German women to be told. And heartbreakingly, there was shame. Society in the 1940s wasn't kind to victims of sexual violence. Women were often blamed or judged. So many chose silence to protect themselves and their families, some even facing rejection from their communities when they tried to speak out. The cultural stigma was crushing. Women who spoke of their assaults risked being ostracized, labeled as dishonored, or even blamed for provoking the attacks, a mindset that silenced countless voices and forced survivors to carry their pain alone, often for decades. But silence doesn't mean it didn't happen. In recent years, historians and researchers have started to uncover these stories. Books like A Woman in Berlin, an anonymous diary from 1945, shedding light on what women went through, survivor testimonies, hidden for decades, finally being heard, reminding us that history isn't just about battles and leaders. It's about people, their pain, and their courage. This diary, written by a woman who endured repeated assaults while documenting her daily struggle to survive, became a powerful testament to the resilience of Berlin's women. Its raw honesty shocking readers when it was first published in the 1950s, only to be met with controversy and backlash from those who felt it tarnished Germany's image. Yet its rediscovery in the early 2000s sparked a renewed interest in these forgotten stories, prompting historians to dig deeper into archives, interview survivors, and piece together a fuller picture of the tragedy. Other sources, like oral histories collected by researchers in the 1990s, reveal the scale of the violence. Some estimates suggest that up to 10% of Berlin's female population may have been affected, with many women assaulted multiple times over weeks or months, their experiences recorded in hushed tones, often only shared with trusted confidants or in private writings never meant to be seen. These accounts, painstakingly gathered by historians like Antony Beevor and Norman Neymark, provide a chilling glimpse into the scope of the crisis, with hospital records from the time showing a surge in women seeking treatment for injuries and infections, though many were turned away due to the collapsed medical system. The reluctance to discuss this tragedy extended beyond Germany. Western allies, too, had their own reasons for downplaying Soviet actions, as they sought to maintain diplomatic ties during the post-war reconstruction, further burying the truth in the name of political expediency. The silence was compounded by the lack of a platform for survivors to share their stories, with few organizations or mechanisms in place to support victims of wartime sexual violence, leaving many women to navigate their trauma in isolation, their voices drowned out by the louder narratives of victory and rebuilding. Let's dig deeper into why this happened. War does something to people. It brings out anger, fear, a need for revenge. The Soviet soldiers who committed these acts had been through hell, their homeland devastated, and to some, attacking German women was a way to get back at the enemy. But revenge doesn't fix anything, it just creates more pain. These women weren't the ones who started the war. Punishing them didn't undo the past. It just broke more lives, a hard lesson about war. It turns people against each other, even the innocent. The Soviet soldiers' experiences on the Eastern Front were brutal. Cities like Stalingrad and Leningrad had been reduced to wastelands, families slaughtered, and the Nazi occupation of Soviet territory had left deep scars, fueling a hatred that, for some, spilled over into acts of vengeance against anyone perceived as German, regardless of their role in the conflict. The Soviet leadership didn't exactly encourage these attacks, but they didn't do much to stop them either. Some officers turned a blind eye, seeing it as a way for soldiers to let off steam. Others even justified it as part of the war's spoils. This lack of accountability making the situation worse, sending a message that these women's lives didn't matter. Military discipline was often lax in the chaotic final days of the war, with Soviet commanders focused on securing Berlin and defeating the last pockets of Nazi resistance, leaving little attention for policing their own troops' behavior, and in some cases, officers participated in or condoned the violence, creating an environment where such acts went unpunished, further dehumanizing the victims in the eyes of the perpetrators. The cultural attitudes of the time also played a role. Wartime propaganda on both sides had demonized the enemy, portraying Germans as monsters and Soviets as liberators, and while this fueled the Soviet soldiers' sense of righteous anger, it also stripped away the humanity of the civilians they encountered, making it easier for some to justify their actions as payback for the suffering inflicted on their own people. This propaganda wasn't just words, it shaped mindsets, turning neighbors into enemies and civilians into targets, a dynamic that fueled the violence and made it easier for perpetrators to see their actions as justified, even when their victims were clearly innocent. The psychological impact on the soldiers themselves is worth considering. Many were young, barely out of their teens, thrust into a war that shattered their sense of morality, their actions in Berlin a reflection of the trauma and desensitization that years of fighting had instilled, though this understanding does not excuse the harm they caused. The broader context of the war's end also contributed. Berlin was a city in collapse, with no functioning government, no police, and no social order, creating a perfect storm where unchecked impulses could run rampant, and the lack of immediate consequences allowed the violence to escalate, leaving a trail of devastation that would haunt the city for generations. So what happened to these women afterward? Life became a daily struggle to survive, the physical injuries bad enough. Some suffered permanent damage or died from the violence. But the emotional toll was heavier, many feeling broken, ashamed, alone, some facing pregnancies from the rapes, bringing more pain and stigma. In a time when abortion was illegal and dangerous, some risking their lives to end these pregnancies, others giving birth and raising children in a world that judged them. The medical system in post-war Berlin was in shambles, with hospitals destroyed or overwhelmed, leaving many women without access to care for their injuries or infections, some facing lifelong health issues as a result, while others battled mental health struggles like depression and post-traumatic stress, conditions barely understood at the time and often dismissed as weakness. Families were affected too. Husbands and fathers, if they survived the war, often didn't know how to help, some rejecting their partners, unable to cope, others standing by their loved ones, but the trauma lingered, affecting relationships for years. In some cases, families were torn apart by the shame and secrecy, with survivors feeling isolated even from those closest to them, while others found solace in tight-knit communities of women who shared their experiences, forming unspoken bonds of survival and mutual support. These communities, often formed in secret, became lifelines for many women, offering a space to share their pain without judgment, though the fear of exposure kept many from speaking openly, even among friends. The children born from these assaults faced their own challenges, often growing up in households marked by silence and stigma, some never knowing their origins, others grappling with the truth later in life, a legacy of pain that rippled across generations. Yet, so many women showed incredible strength, going back to work, rebuilding homes, raising families, finding ways to keep going, a testament to the power of the human spirit, reminding us that even when everything feels lost, people can find a way forward. Take the story of Elise, a 40-year-old widow who, after enduring multiple assaults, took in orphaned children from her neighborhood, creating a makeshift family in a bombed-out apartment, her determination to care for others a defiant act of hope in the face of despair. Or consider Hannah, a teenager who survived an attack and later became a nurse, dedicating her life to helping others heal, her compassion born from her own pain. Stories like these showing that resilience isn't just about surviving, it's about finding purpose, about choosing to live despite the weight of trauma. Another survivor, Clara, a 28-year-old factory worker, found solace in gardening, planting seeds in the ruins of her backyard as a way to reclaim control over her life, her small garden becoming a symbol of renewal for her and her neighbors, who joined her in tending it, creating a community of healing amid the destruction. These acts of defiance and hope weren't just personal, they inspired others, showing that even in the aftermath of unimaginable loss, life could be rebuilt, one small step at a time, a reminder that the human spirit can endure even the darkest nights. Another woman, Liesel, a 32-year-old librarian, began collecting books salvaged from the ruins, creating a small lending library for her community, her efforts to preserve knowledge and stories a way to restore a sense of normalcy and hope, while Marta, a 45-year-old mother, organized storytelling circles for children, using fairy tales to distract them from the horrors around them, her voice a soothing balm in a world of chaos. These stories of resilience highlight the myriad ways women found to cope, from creative outlets to acts of service, each one a testament to their strength and a challenge to the narrative of victimhood, showing that even in the face of unimaginable pain, they could carve out spaces of meaning and connection. This story raises big questions. What does it mean to be human in a time of war? How do we hold people accountable for atrocities when everyone's pointing fingers? How do we make sure something like this never happens again? One lesson is the importance of empathy. These women were victims of a war they didn't choose. Their suffering reminds us that every person, no matter who they are, deserves dignity. War doesn't just destroy buildings, it destroys lives, and we have to remember the human cost. Empathy means seeing the humanity in everyone, even those labeled as the enemy, recognizing that civilians, like the women of Berlin, were not responsible for the crimes of their leaders, and their suffering demands our compassion, not our judgment. This call for empathy extends beyond the past. It challenges us to look at modern conflicts, where civilians continue to bear the brunt of violence, and ask how we can foster a world that values every life, regardless of nationality or circumstance. Another lesson is justice. The men who committed these crimes were rarely punished, the Soviet leadership didn't hold trials, and the world moved on, that lack of accountability leaving wounds that never fully healed. So today we must push for justice, not just for past crimes but for those happening now, needing systems to protect the vulnerable and hold people accountable no matter how powerful. The absence of justice in 1945 left a legacy of pain, but it also highlights the need for international laws and institutions, like the Geneva Conventions, to protect civilians in wartime, and for modern efforts to prosecute war crimes, ensuring that victims have a voice and perpetrators face consequences, regardless of political alliances. The establishment of the International Criminal Court in 2002, though imperfect, is a step toward this goal, offering a framework to address wartime atrocities. Yet its limitations remind us that justice requires global cooperation and unwavering commitment, something the women of Berlin never received. Finally, this is a call to remember. By talking about Berlin in 1945, we honor the women who survived, giving them a voice that was taken away, reminding ourselves that history is about people, their pain, their strength. Remembering isn't just about looking back. It's about learning, about carrying these stories forward to build a world where such atrocities are unthinkable, where we prioritize the dignity of every person, no matter the circumstances. This act of remembrance is active. It involves teaching these stories in schools, preserving survivor testimonies in archives, and ensuring that future generations understand the full scope of war's impact, not just on battlefields but in the lives of ordinary people. So what can we do today? First, listen. There are still survivors of war atrocities, and their stories matter, whether from modern conflicts or past tragedies. We need to hear and believe them. In places like Syria, Ukraine, or other conflict zones, women and girls continue to face sexual violence as a weapon of war, And by listening to their stories, we validate their experiences and amplify their calls for justice, just as we must do for the women of Berlin. Organizations like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch document these modern atrocities, providing platforms for survivors to share their truths, and by engaging with their work, we can better understand the ongoing fight for justice. Second, educate ourselves. History isn't always comfortable, but it's important. Learning about Berlin in 1945 helps us understand the true cost of war, sharing these stories to build a world where compassion comes first. Education means reading books, watching documentaries, visiting museums, or even talking to older generations who lived through these times, piecing together a fuller understanding of the past to inform our actions in the present. Resources like the German Historical Museum or online archives of survivor testimonies offer invaluable insights, and by sharing these with others, we keep the conversation alive, ensuring that the lessons of 1945 aren't lost to time. Third, advocate for change. Support organizations helping survivors of sexual violence, push for policies protecting civilians in conflict zones, and speak up against injustice. Silence hid this tragedy for decades. Our voices can ensure it's never forgotten. Organizations like UN Women or local shelters provide critical support to survivors, while advocacy groups push for stronger protections in war zones, and every small action, whether signing a petition, donating, or sharing a story, helps build a culture of accountability and care. Grassroots movements, like those led by survivors in countries affected by modern conflicts, show the power of collective action, and by supporting them, we contribute to a global effort to protect the vulnerable and demand justice. As we close, I want to honor the women of Berlin, 1945, who faced horrors most of us can't imagine, yet found the strength to keep going. Their courage, resilience, and humanity reminding us what it means to survive. This video isn't just about the past. It's about the lessons we carry into the future, about remembering that every person deserves dignity. These women, through their survival, teach us about the power of hope, the importance of standing together, and the need to fight for a world where no one has to endure such pain. Their stories a call to action for all of us to be better, to do better, to ensure that history doesn't repeat itself. Their legacy is not just one of suffering but of triumph, of choosing to rebuild in the face of destruction, of finding light in the darkest moments. And by sharing their stories, we commit to a future where compassion and justice prevail, where the voices of the silenced are finally heard. Thank you for joining me on this journey. It's not an easy story, but it needs to be heard. So please hit the like button, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more stories that matter. Let's keep these conversations going, because the truth deserves to be told. Until next time, take care, and let's work together to build a world where compassion wins.